This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that gets in the way of it. Our guest today is Juliet Rieden, the author of Quentin Bryce, the Authorised Biography. Quentin Bryce, of course, an Australian trailblazer, feminist, reformer, and the country's first female Governor-General. She's lived her life at the highest levels of leadership while staying deeply rooted in family, community, and compassion. In this conversation, Juliet unpacks not just Quentin's achievements, but the values and practices that have guided her intentionality, the resilience that she's developed, and why she has such a care for others. Juliet, many of us will know Quentin for being a trailblazer, for her political, her career achievements, but how would you describe her?
Look, I think I would describe Dame Quentin as a powerful reformer. She's kind, she's generous, she's a compassionate human being. She cares so deeply about changing the world. And, you know, she that was something that mattered to her from a very young age. She sort of decided as a teenager that what she wanted to do was change the world, and then pretty much went ahead and proceeded in that and did it. What she wanted to do was make Australia especially a better place. And again, I think we saw that she's done that. She's achieved that. On a personal level, she's got such this intense capacity for friendship. And I found that a lot in my research. I interviewed an awful lot of her friends. I spoke to Quentin herself about friendship. And I sort of learned a lot about how much that matters to her, but also how it should matter to all of us. It's creating your own community. It's supporting people. It's that two-way thing that you get from friendship. And for Quentin, it runs very, very deep. You know, she writes so many letters, reams and reams and reams of letters. I've got boxes of them behind me here that I went through for the book. And they're really revealing, they're really touching, they're very caring. They're to people she knows very well. They're also to people she has just met and starts new conversations with, and to lots of people who wrote to her when she was Governor-General. And she wrote back hundreds of letters. So I think that loyalty, that integrity that guides her, this is also who she is as a person.
Does it take a lot to convince somebody to give you that much of their personal correspondence and invite you into their life in that way?
Look, I think that the history of this book is that I have known Quentin for quite a long while. And I first met her when I was writing another book called The Royals in Australia, and she had just recently left the office of the Governor-General, and I wanted to talk to her about what it was like working with the Royals, and she agreed to talk to me. And I met her in a hotel room here in Sydney, and we just hit it off. We just clicked. And then over the years since then, I interviewed her many, many times for the Australian Women's Weekly, and I went traveling with her for those stories. So we got to know each other very well. And I think she trusted my integrity. She trusted my journalism. She knew who I was. She enjoyed my writing. And so when I then approached her to write her authorised biography, she did go away and think about it. It wasn't an immediate yes. And then she came back to me and said yes. And when she said yes, she was all in. She knew that I would want access to all of her personal archives that she was able to give me. I knew she had diaries. I knew she had letters. And she was happy to do that. She trusted me. And I take that trust very seriously. And it is necessary when you're writing a biography. You do have to have that primary source material. I also interviewed, more than 100 people. So I didn't just interview Quentin and spend a long time with Quentin, hours and hours interviewing her over, the course of 18 months. I interviewed her family, that many of them have not spoken before, and they trusted me, and that was lovely. But I interviewed lots and lots of people around her life. So we're talking about personal friends, but we're also talking about people in public life. We're talking about prime ministers. We're talking about people who work in the households of the Office of the Governor General, her official secretary, Stephen Brady, for instance. And all of them spoke to me on the record, and all of them were happy to speak to me because Quentin said, I'd like you to speak to Juliet. She didn't then monitor any of it. People could say what they wanted. And I think it was probably quite confronting for her when she finally saw the finished work and saw what people had been saying. But for me, it was very important to get that fully rounded story of Quentin, not just from her mouth, but from the mouths of all of those around her.
When you went back into some of her earlier life, her teenage years, this point where she's found that passion to really want to drive change in a positive way, what was it that sparked that desire in her, do you think?
I think it comes a bit from her background. Her parents, very community-minded people, very much about giving back, lots of volunteering in their background, an innate interest in human rights and advocacy for human rights. She became a lawyer, first of all, before she went into public roles in human rights. And I just think it's part of who she is. She wanted to change the world. She thought, quite naively, that she could change the world, but then she went ahead and did it. And I think that is the extraordinary thing about Quentin herself.
And this mindset of why not, it really pops up as something that shapes so much of her choices. How much of an influence did that have over her career?
Look, I think it influenced everything. Quentin grabs opportunities with both hands. She would say that her career path has been dictated by luck. And of course, there is an element of that. But Quentin never shies away from difficult, sometimes very scary jobs. She jumps in, she has this have a go mentality, and that sort of edge of fear that stops a lot of us from putting up our hands for that sort of thing somehow seems to energize her. She overcomes her nerves, and then she's sailing forth. And I'm not saying that those jobs then were easy. They weren't. They were often very hard jobs indeed. But she's not one to give in. And she always has her sights on what will come next. And it's a great lesson when you look back over what she has achieved and how she has achieved it.
How do you think she's been able to step over some of the understandable fears?
I think that inner confidence that she has is really as a result of her parents, her education. There were 4 sisters. She's one of 4, and they were raised in a household that was very gender non-specific, that gender was never going to get in the way of what they wanted to do. Her father said, you can be whatever you want to be. You've just got to work hard. And that is pretty much what all of the 4 girls believed and what they did. I think also coming from a rural, tiny town, Ilfracombe in Queensland, it sort of prepared her, it gave her a resilience, and it prepared her for community life. It prepared her to take control of her own life. It gave her a freedom over everything that she wanted to do. And I think we've seen that in the job choices that she's made and in the trailblazer that she's become.
And coming from that background, it is no wonder then that women's equality has been something that she has fought so fiercely for. Were there specific moments, or what moments, I suppose, really stood out to you as key turning points for Quentin in her drive towards women's equality?
There are quite a few key turning points. I would just say that idea of women's rights is innate for Quentin. It's something that should be a given in her eyes. And I think, therefore, when she saw that there were things holding women back, it kind of made her a bit cranky, and she thought, I've got to do something about this. She went to London in the late 60s, the swinging 60s in London, a time of massive social revolution. Whole of Europe was behind it. Over in Paris, they were burning down the universities almost. And she saw all of that and loved it and really drank it all in and came back to Australia with this verve for changing the world, really, and changing the world for women and changing the world for children. I would say that 1978, when she was asked to work for the National Women's Advisory Council to advise the government on issues facing women, she was part of a team of women that were chosen from all over Australia. I think that was the start of that personal becoming political for her. That ability to really affect change at quite a high level was suddenly in her sights. And then, of course, the big one for her would have been becoming Sex Discrimination Commissioner. That was 10 years after that in 1988, and administering the Sex Discrimination Act, which, had become law 4 years before, and now was starting to be able to be used in the workplace and in all sorts of places, in sports, everywhere. That was very hard work, but it was very thrilling work. And I think she really got the bit between her teeth then.
And as she's rising through the ranks and having these professional successes, personal victories in so many ways, how exposed was she to criticism and misogyny?
Look, I was surprised at some of the tough gullies that Quentin calls them that she faced. They were more than tough gullies. They were really, really hard times. Lots of sexism, lots of misogyny. It's very hard being the first woman in a role, of course, and that's what she was as Governor General. She noticed that isolation that faces women when they get into senior roles, and I noticed that a lot in my research as well. We've seen that with people like, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who, of course, Quentin swore in a moment in history with a female Governor General, our first female Governor General, signing in our first and to date, alas, only female Prime Minister. She saw that too, and she faced that misogyny. Part of it is tall poppy syndrome. Part of it is pure sexism, and she got it from every side. I'd like to think that we're getting better at it. That sexism isn't nearly as pronounced as it once was. Certainly, Quentin went through a very rough time then.
Did she reveal anything about how she stayed focused in spite of some of that pushback?
I think it was hard. She just always believed in what she was doing. And she always looked at what was ahead and what she needed to do, and focused back on the job. Some of those things, they do stop you in your tracks, but sometimes they make you stronger as well. And I think in Quentin's case, they did make her stronger. It didn't make it any the less more difficult to deal with. She did have some support around her, and she did, of course, have the unwavering support of her husband, Michael Bryce, who was by her side throughout the whole thing and really helped her.
Did he seem like a sort of man in the shadows to you, or did he have a more significant role, do you think, in the way Quentin lived her life and does live her life?
Oh, he has a very significant role, yes. I was lucky enough to know Michael quite well and met him and interviewed him extensively before he died. And I was so well aware of how important he was in her life. He was a cornerstone, definitely. And she would say that. She would say that her marriage was the most important thing in her life. And then, of course, the family that they had together. Michael was sort of the wind beneath her sails, but he was also a trailblazer himself in his own right as an architect and a designer. And he had to give a lot up for Quentin, but he didn't ever think that was a sacrifice. He wanted to support her. He was so proud of her. And he was very much by her side. So I don't think, he did have to do that, walking two steps behind thing, in as Governor General's husband, spouse. It was the first time we'd had a male in that role of spouse in the Governor General's role. And, he used to joke about saying he would write a book and it would be called And You Are, because that was what was constantly said to him when he turned up at events with her, and they would open the door for her out of the car and he'd be left to get out himself. But no, he was such a support to her, definitely.
He must have had an extraordinary amount of humility and grace to handle that, because I'm not sure everybody could.
No, I agree with you, but I don't think Michael would say it was humility. Their relationship was incredibly equal. When I talk to their children, they talk about how they were raised in this innately feminist household, that everyone was a feminist. There are 3 boys and 2 girls, and all of them were feminists. And Michael was the most ardent feminist of them all as their father. And everything was equal. They shared everything. They shared household duties. They shared financial duties. They shared parenting duties. When Quentin went to take up the role of Sex Discrimination Commissioner, she thought long and hard about it, not because she didn't want the role, but because the role was in Sydney and she lived in Brisbane, and the family house was in Brisbane. And so it was Michael who said, no, you've got to take this role. You can't let that hold you back. So she went and moved to Sydney. It was actually the first time in her life she ever lived on her own. She lived in a little flat in the centre of Sydney and then would go home at the weekends, and Michael would come over during the week sometimes as well, because he had an office in Sydney in addition to his practice main office back in Brisbane. And that was part of who they were. Lots of people would think, gosh, how can a mother of 5 then go and move to Sydney? Some of the children were grown up and had moved out of home by then, but there was still a couple back at home and there was still a household to run. And Michael pulled that together and Quentin came back at the weekend. It was the most amazing equal relationship, perhaps before its time when you look back at society at the time, but certainly it didn't seem like that to the Bryce household. It felt normal.
How did the pair of them meet?
That is a long story, but they actually met as children because Michael's sister was Quentin's best friend. And so Quentin used to hang out at the Bryce household as a little kid, mucking around, and Michael was a little bit older. And he met Quentin then, but she was just, as he called her, an ankle biter then. But they really got together at university. He was in the architects department. She was a law student, and they were a golden couple. He fell in love with her on site pretty much at university, and then went about wooing her.
It's so delightful. I love a good love story. And of course, it's the heartbreak that comes when Quentin loses him. After 47 years of marriage, Michael passes away. Is there something that, she did, do you think, to survive the loss of him?
Look, I don't think it's anything that she did. It's not a matter of survival, but it is of going through grief and loss. And I think she was, she never expected to lose Michael. She always thought that he would be there forever. He was her soulmate. She thought he would always be by her side. So when he got ill and then he died, it was a lot for her to take on board, as it would be for anyone losing their partner of many decades. And it took a long time. Of course, she would always survive it, but it does change you. And I think she found the grief very isolating. There's a loneliness in grief that you're really, really on your own going through it. I think looking back, she might think that she did go into a sort of depression at that time, but didn't really realize it. You can never get over losing your life partner. And Quentin, of course, will never get over it, but you learn to live with it and you learn to move on. She's a very optimistic person anyway. It is part of who she is. It's in her nature. But I know that the things that really feed her, which I've got a chapter in the book called Soul Food. And her soul food are nature, the great Australian bush, especially around Queensland, where she was raised, up in the rainforests, where she and Michael used to go walking, where she went walking as a child. She's a real tree hugger, I would say, but also music. She listens to music at incredibly high decibels every day. She's a massive art lover. She has a lot of friends who are artists. Literature, theatre. She goes to the theatre all the time. She goes to concerts all the time. These are things that are important to her. And beauty. She sees beauty everywhere. She sees beauty in a flower. She sees beauty in a work of art. She sees beauty in the young kids that she mentors. It's everywhere for her.
Yeah, sort of a constant exposure to inspiration, it sounds like. And during the course of her career, she made such distinct efforts, I think, to connect with Indigenous communities, Indigenous Australians. Why was that something that was so important to her?
It was when Quentin met Connie Bush, who she was on the National Women's Advisory Council with. So that was in 1978. And Connie was an Indigenous woman from the Northern Territories. And she learnt for the first time then about the stolen generations. Quentin really didn't know very much about that. And she was shocked. She was really shocked. And that changed her perception of Australia. It changed her life forever. And it made Indigenous Australia part of what she was going to connect with from that moment on. It was an epiphany, really. She saw that injustice. She was horrified. She was devastated. She started to go out into Indigenous communities to focus on meeting people, to understand their needs and issues. It became part of every job she had after that. And she made a commitment to working for Indigenous rights. And then that commitment stayed with her. And, you know, it continues today.
I was going to ask you, now that Quentin's obviously outside of some of these roles, are the bugbears of wanting to see Indigenous communities better looked after, of wanting to see women's equality, something that is just standard in society, does that drive and desire for those things to change still play out very much in her life now?
Oh, goodness, all the time. Yes. I mean, her royalties from this book are going to the Queensland Women's Legal Service, which is a service for domestic violence victims or survivors, people who are going through domestic violence when they need legal help. She is involved in a lot of charitable work. She is also involved in the Path to Treaty for Indigenous truth-telling in Queensland. None of that work has stopped. None of that work has stopped at all. It's all very much part of who Quentin is. She is still passionate and will never stop being passionate about rights for women and children. We've still got a long way to go.
What do you think the core message of Quentin's life will be?
For me, the core message is never be afraid of giving things a go, even if they frighten you a little. Jump in. You can always change your mind if it doesn't work out, she says. Not that she ever really did change her mind. And then there's this thing that she has said to many people, that you can have it all, but not at the same time. And that is very true. And I think still holds true. You know, that's a thing that she especially shares with women who are juggling motherhood and careers and wanting to do great things in society and in community. You just have to focus and pace yourself and find the thing that can help you through it. She does fervently believe that you can, of course, be a mother and have a great career and change the world. And she certainly is proof that that can happen.
You'd easily think that somebody with the strong feminist views that she holds and the way she has been such a trailblazer, that they could so easily have a perspective that sets family life and kids and everything in the background. But she really hasn't demonstrated her views like that. She has been able to show this really holistic picture, I think, of a life that allows you to enjoy all of those different things.
Yes, of course. I mean, for her, everything is part of a whole. You know, the personal became political. She's a mother. She wants better services for mothers. She's a woman. She wants better services for women. She wants rights for women. She wants better rights in the workplace. She wants affirmative action to get more women in leading roles in politics, in society, in every aspect of society. She wants women to live their whole life, and she has certainly managed to do that. And there is no reason why anyone can't do that as far as she's concerned. And on that path, you know, she's bringing men along too in this journey. It isn't just about women, it's about everyone respecting each other and respecting women's life and being part of the community.
And you've got to be immersed in her life as a friend, as somebody writing about it, of course, in this context. How has that affected you being so intimately involved in the way that Quentin lives her life?
Look, I'm not sure I would say I'm intimately involved. We know each other very well. I have been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with Quentin, and it has been wonderful getting to know her so well and getting to know every aspect of her life. She's taught me a great deal, I think, about the power of reform, about implementing change, about not just talking the talk, but walking it. You know, she says that a true feminist is someone who believes in feminism and then acts on it, then does something about it. There are a lot of people who talk about it and don't do it. She's also taught me a lot about the importance of friendship, about that mutual, deep, supporting, life-affirming relationships that you can forge, and about giving back, about being a good person in your community, about, this cult of individualism at the moment is very much not what Quentin Bryce is all about. You know, Quentin Bryce is about being part of something, about looking after each other, about having compassion, about being a necessary part of your community. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. That isn't old-fashioned. That is part of how we're going to go forward as communities from here on in.
Juliet, thank you so much for taking us a little bit more into her life and for your time today. I really appreciate it.
A pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Undistracted. You can let me know what you think. Find me on Instagram at laura.bennett_. You can email undistracted@hope1032.com.au and find more episodes, video versions of these conversations on the Hope 1032 YouTube channel. Until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.